Hi everybody. I want to do a quick demo on how to go about deploying your application. And just to sort of see things from the ground up, let's actually create the application that we end up deploying. So I'm going to create this application called Acme Deploy, and I'm going to say npm init. So like I told you before, if you want to see the script files that you have or the script tags that you can run, if you type npm run, it won't run anything. It'll just tell you that we have an npm test, which doesn't do anything. So what I'm going to do here is set up my npm test, and let's open up our project. So if we're going to do this, let's actually first go in to npm to, actually did that in the wrong file. Let me get rid of that file. rm package.json, and let me go into my Acme Deploy. Okay, so let's close this out. And let's go through this one more time. npm install, npm init, excuse me. And I'm going to open up Vim. And so what I'm going to want to do here is set up my test. And so let's assume that I have some database. I'll say connection string. And this is going to be Postgres. And this is going to be localhost. And let's just create a brand new database that doesn't exist. I'm going to call this Acme Deploy Test. And we're going to run node modules, bin, mocha, bin, mocha, and that's going to be the test that will end up running. I think that should probably be enough. So now if I say npm test, it's not going to know about mocha, so let's install mocha, npm install mocha, save dev. Okay. And let me install chai. And at this point, we get our standard error message. Actually, I put the wrong path here for this. So this is going to be node modules mocha bin mocha. And so now, if I say npm test, we should get a more familiar message that it can't find any files to test. So let's add a file. And we'll go in here, and let's just say we're going to test our model. So I'm going to say models.spec.js. And we'll go over here, and let's do a describe. And let's say that we have, let's keep it simple. Let's just say we have a user model. We want to describe it. First thing I like to do, make sure it exists. So I say it, and we'll say exists. And we'll go over here and we'll say expect user to be okay. Of course, running that, we'll see the errors that we end up getting. Let me close some of these out. So the error that we end up getting there is that expect is not defined. Let's put this below so we could actually just see that it's failing, or maybe side by side. So we'll have to bring in expect, which is from Chai. It's library, and it's the expect function. Now it tells us user doesn't exist. So again, we could just get a pass here by doing this, and this would be enough to get it to pass. So now our test is passing. And one thing that I actually want to do, I want to have this test run continuously. So one thing that I forgot to do was to actually call Mocha with NodeMon. And now if I end up running this, we'll see that it'll end up waiting and looking for changes. So let's go back over here and let's assume that we're going to have some way of, we'll put it before each. Let's assume that I have some way of syncing my database, or let's actually say seeding my database. So let's just pretend that I have some function called seed, and when it's done, I'm going to call done. And now let's do a expectation. We'll say there are 2 users. So we're going to seed our database with Mo and Larry, and this is going to be something that's going to be asynchronous because we're going to be hitting the database eventually. So I'll say done, and I'll say expect, I'll say user find all, then function this is going to give me my users back, and I'll say that I expect users dot length to equal 2. I'm going to call done, and just in case there's an error here so it doesn't time out, I'll put a catch here and say done as well. So this is going to bomb out because DB is not defined, so let's go up here and we'll say, hey look, we do have a DB, even though we don't, and we'll go up 1 level. We'll have a DB folder that's going to have an index file. Furthermore, we'll have models equals DB models, and user is going to be models.user. And now this will fail for another reason because it's not going to be finding DB. So we'll go over here, open up a new tab. We'll add a folder for DB, add an index.js file. And here's where we're going to need sequelize. So we'll say sequelize equals require sequelize. And here's our actual connection to the database, DB, which is new, sequelize, and this is going to be process environment connection. I'm going to change this at some point, but we'll keep it here at the moment. I'll explain why in a little bit when we end up going to deploy. I'm going to say user equals DB define user, and we'll go in here and we'll just say that there's a name, which is a sequelize string. And we could go over here and we could say module.exports, and we'll end up exporting our models. And let's also let's export a seed method. So what is that seed method gonna end up looking like? Well, we know it's gonna return a promise, that we know. And also, let me go over here. I forgot one more thing. We'll say models equals and this is going to be we'll have a user model, which is going to be user. And again, you don't have to necessarily type this much at the same time. I mean, you could do a little bit at a time here. Here we'd get an error that I can't read property then of undefined. That's because seed is not returning anything. Well, when we go to seed, I'm going to break this up into two parts. Not only am I going to have a seed, but I'm actually going to have a sync as well. This is actually going to end up creating my tables. And I'm putting it there because I am going to need it at some point. Or at least I might need it at some point. We'll talk about that. But when I go to sync, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, when I go to seed, I'm going to sync. And this is going to be sync. Then we're going to seed. What is seed going to look like? Well, let's just say that we will say promise.all, and we'll put in two promises. And we'll say user create, and this will be name Mo, and this will be user create, name Larry. So those will be the two promises, and make sure we need to return here from here. And when we go to sync, what we're going to end up doing, and this is going to have to be a return as well, promise.all. So when we go to sync, we're going to say, hey, look, DB, and again, make sure we return. These are all promises, db.sync, force is true. So we could end up doing that, and let's see what happens. Unexpected token, so yeah, these should be a comma. And we get an issue because our database doesn't exist. And we'll talk about what's gonna, how we're gonna create this database when we deploy it. Locally, we know that we could, so this is gonna be Acme Deploy test. So I'll go over there and open up pSQL, create database, Acme Deploy test. And we know that, see the underscores or dashes that it doesn't like. I don't think it likes dashes. So we'll put underscores in here. And let's just make sure we'll go back to our package JSON and make sure that we do underscores there. So now our database should exist. And if we go back over here, again, NodeMon doesn't know that we made a change to our database, so I have to run npm test again, and it passes. All right, so sort of part of the way there. We could, if we wanted to, write another test for a super test to get our data. That's a pretty quick one here. Do a real quick one. I mean, by the way, one other thing that we should really make sure that we have, this is going to be critical, is that I must have SQLize and Postgres installed globally. You really need to have this, especially when you're deploying in your file. So I'm going to say npm install pg and SQLize, and I'm going to save this. Very important that it gets saved. When this ends up getting saved, this file will end up changing. And I'll have those two things here. And let me also, just so we could run a quick test with our super test, let's say npm install super test. This is going to be saved as a development dependency. And this will change this file as well. And we could go real quickly and write a quick test for this. So we've got our test for our models. Let's add a test for our routes.spec.js. And again, we'll get this started by, we know we're going to need our models. So we'll go do actually let's bring in our DB, because we're going to want to get some data in there before each of our tests. Again, we don't want to assume that our tests get written in any order. So even though we're seeding in the other file, it's not necessary to seed here. excuse me, we still have to do it here because we don't know what order the tests run in. And we don't really want to have any sort of dependencies on what order the tests run. That gets to be a little bit tricky when you do that. So we're going to go over here. We're going to grab our DB. We'll grab our models. We'll grab our user. And we're going to need supertest. We're actually going to need a client, and we're going to get our client by assuming that we have supertest, and we're going to pass in here a yet to be created /app. So now we've got a client, and let's do a describe, and we're going to describe our routes. And we're going to have one route that we're going to describe will be RESTful, even in this tiny application, for users. And we'll specify it returns to users. Again, we're going to have to put in our seed function. So our expectation is that we're going to specify that our client is going to do a get. We're going to expect a 200. When this ends, we'll either get an error or result. And we'll specify if, in fact, we have an error, we're going to return done with the error. Otherwise, we'll write our expectation. Our expectation is going to be result. And here we're going to just return JSON data to keep it simple. We'll say result.body.length, and it's an expectation, to equal 2. And here we'll specify done, and we'll make sure that we also pass in our done. And if this is running here, our test says it can't find this module app, so let's create this module app. And this will be an app.js. We're going to need Express, so let's make sure we install that. Npm Install Express, save. So we'll go over here and we'll specify that here's our Express, here's our app, and we're just going to have one route, but let's assume that we were doing a RESTful route. So we'll say app.use users, and we'll go and require, and let's assume we have a routes folder for users. And we want to make sure also, very important, we end up saying module.exports equals app, so that supertest will have something to work with. Of course, we do this, we'll get another error message here, and this is that it can't find the routes for users. So we'll go over here, add routes, add users. And here, let's actually bring in our user model. So our user model is going to be require. We go one level up to DB. And I'll just put in here in one shot models.user. And here we're going to have a router, which is going to be require express.router. We're going to make sure we export that. And let's go over here and we'll do our route. So our route is going to be router.get. And it's going to be users, but we're already mounting it up to users in the app.js. So we'll put a function here, request response next. And we'll simply say user.findAll. Then we'll get our users. We'll say response.send users. And we'll go over here and we'll specify a catch, and we'll call the error handler so it catches an error and it doesn't just sit there forever if there's a problem. So router.use, it's not finding this router. requires middleware function. Looks like we're actually doing that. Let me make sure I'm not missing something here. Module.exports. Oh, I don't know why I did this. So this is express.router. Start that again. And express is not defined. I think maybe I got rid of it accidentally. We could actually do this in one line. Require express. Expected 200, got a 404. So let's just take a look at our app. App.use, users require, routes.users. So let's take a look and see why this is not finding this route. Okay, so this was foolish. I realized here that on my test, I was getting a 404 because I was actually trying to go to get just the route. So here, expect, not defined. So let's bring that in. And now we should pass. And just to be on the safe side here, let's just do a before each. And we'll go over here, and we'll say db.seed, then function done, and we'll put a catch of done just in case we actually don't have data in here, that the other test doesn't run first, and let's just make sure we put in done here. So now we're actually going to have this thing running. So what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to go to my package JSON. I'm going to copy this. And since I just want to be able to do npm start, I'm going to modify the connection. Because again, I don't want to use my test when I'm running this. And I'm also going to want to have a port as well. And here we'll just run nodemon, and let's say that we have a server that we're going to end up starting. So we've got our app, but we actually have to set our app to listen, and let's do a port of 3000. So what we can do here is that we can go over here, we could create a server.js, and we'll bring in our app. And let's also bring in our server. We could do this in one shot. Server equals require HTTP, create server, and this is going to need an app, and we'll pass in our app. And we're going to tell our app to listen. So we'll specify that our server is going to listen at process environment port, and we'll put a function here just so we could see that it's listening. Console.log listening on port plus process environment port. So we could close our test here for a second, and let's do npm start. So this runs, and let's just see what happens when we go and listen to it, or go to run it. This is going to be localhost 3000. We only have the one route for users. And we get an exception message because deploy doesn't exist. Now, there's a couple of things you could do here. What I'm going to do is write a couple of other tasks here that I'm going to be able to run. And what I'm going to do here is put in I'm going to modify this, and I'm going to say if process environment, and I'll specify if process environment, and I'll say if I end up passing in seed, we'll have it end up seeding the data. So if seed exists, we'll go over here and we'll specify that we are going to, let's grab our user, and this is going to be require /db models.user. And when we go to seed, we'll specify db seed, then function, and we'll do a catch just in case there's an error. And we'll seed, and we'll say console.log seeded. So we'll go over here and we'll set that up. And so let's say either we'll end up seeding, well, we can end up seeding or listening. Probably, the main thing is we want to make sure that our database gets seeded. That's what it ends up coming down to. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to my package.json file, and I'm literally going to copy this start, and instead of start, I'm going to say sync. I really don't need the port, and I'm not going to use nodemon. And I'm going to kill this. I'm just doing this to get my database seeded, and I'm going to say npm run. I think I called it, sorry about that, called it seed. So let me go over here and call this seed. Let's call the task seed, and we'll also have to set that environment variable of seed equals true. So once I end up doing that, now I could run npm run seed. Again, I have to do run there. And let's just take a look here. db is not defined, and let's just take a look. If db is not defined, it's not defined because we do have the user. Actually, I don't need user, I just need db. So now let's go back here, run that one more time. Listening on port, database Acme Deploy. I do have to go and create the database, right? I have to create the database. That I need to do. So let me do that. So this is going to be Acme Deploy. And if we wanted to get some data in here, and it's not just data, right? Sync is also going to create our tables. So let's make sure this works by going in here and connecting to Acme Deploy. And here's our users table, which is what we want. And now if I go over here and I start my application by saying npm start, so I created those two different tasks. One is going to be seeding, the other one's going to be starting. Npm start, our app should start, and here's our two pieces of data. So now that we have this, let's go and deploy it. Now I've got some Heroku, something called Heroku CLI, where my environment is set up with Heroku, which is deployed globally. I also set up Heroku, not that I pay anything, but I give them a credit card, and this way I can really create as many projects as I want to here. So if I was to go and open up Heroku, and if I'm still logged in here, which I am, these are all the apps that I have running. So a bunch of different apps that I have here. This is a bunch of the Acme projects that I have. So what I want to have happen here is I want to have Acme Deploy show up here. So there's this, and you could look on the Heroku site, but there's something called Heroku CLI, It's the Heroku command line, which you can install locally. I think it's also called the Heroku tool belt, and it's fairly easy to install. So I've got it installed on my machine. So what I'm going to be able to do is tell Heroku that I want to create another app. And I'm going to call this Acme Deploy. So Heroku has the opposite thing. If with them you got to use dashes. So I'll say Acme Deploy. Okay, so now I've got this deployed. Now I want to push it up to Heroku. If I go over here and I refresh this, I'll see Acme Deploy is here, but there really is nothing going on with it. In fact, it doesn't even know what type of application it is. So this actually gets, the way that this ends up getting pushed is that I'm going to say git init, git.add, git.commit, m first commit. And I'm going to specify git.push. I'm using git to push, but where am I pushing to? I want to push to Heroku. So one of the things that happens here is that if I say git remote.v, when I end up creating that Heroku app, what it ends up doing, git not remove, remote.v, that's not the command I'm looking for. Well, let's see what happens here. What I want to be able to do is to push up to Heroku, so I'm going to say git.push Heroku master. I'm pushing the master branch up to Heroku. Heroku does not appear to be a Git repository. Let's try this one more time. I'm not sure. It looks like something was a little bit screwy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this app on Heroku that got created. I'm just going to start this again. When you go to delete an app on Heroku, it's basically saying, you sure? Wants to make sure you really are positive. You want to delete it, and I just deleted it. And I'm going to try to add it again. Let's see what happens. Heroku create Acme Deploy. Now, what I should be able to do when that happens, say git.push Heroku master. Now that worked. You know what could have happened? It could have been the order that I ended up doing this in. Perhaps if I had this set up as a Git repository right off the bat, then this would have worked. It would have been Git repository. I would have created the Heroku app afterwards. And what I was trying to show you before, if I say git remote-v, what it does is it tells you where it's going to end up pushing to. When I say git.push to Heroku, this is where it ends up pushing. So the same way that you could push to GitHub, you basically have the ability to push to Heroku. And again, I think what the issue was there is that I didn't have a Git repository when I created the Heroku app. If I had, it would have actually added this in, and then I would have been able to push. So that's a new one. I didn't know that before. And what I want to do is I want to go to this site. Now, very often when you deploy, things won't work as you think they're going to work. And you'll get an application error. And it doesn't mean all that much to you. But if I go over here, I could go in and type in Heroku Logs. And it basically will pull down what the issues are here on Heroku. And there's a couple of issues that I'm going to run into here. So let's actually see. Sometimes you got to get these a little bit at a time. So one of them is telling me, hey, look, I don't know anything about NodeMon. And that's a result of the fact that when we look at our package.json, we don't, on Heroku, there's a couple of things. First of all, Heroku determines the port. So we could take this off. That's one thing. Second thing is that we're not going to run this with NodeMon. We're not continually watching on Heroku because we can't go up there and manually change files anyway. It doesn't make any sense. You don't want to do that in any kind of production environment. So one of the things that I'll do here is that I'll set this up now. Notice if I do this now, I can't run locally. So one of the things I'll do is that I'll do something like a start dev And this is the one where I'll say port equals 3000. And I'll go back over here, and this is where I'll run nodemon. So when I'm running locally, I'll say npm run start :dev. And on Heroku, start will automatically end up getting called. That's what Heroku does. It will run npm start when the application starts. So now when I do this, if I look at my status, I've changed that file. Let me add this. Change start. And again, I can push my master branch to Heroku. And when this gets done, build ended up succeeding. And let's go back here. And we'll run this again. And we have a cannot get. That's not the worst thing in the world. So let's say users. And we get an internal server error, which is not all that much help. So let's go back and we'll do Heroku Logs. And if we scroll up and look at this, it says you got a problem. You got a connection error. It doesn't know anything about this port. So one of the things that you could do on Heroku, now I don't know if this is, if you have to have you might have to update your account in order to do this, but if I end up going and finding my Acme Deploy, and I go in here, and I look at my settings, and I've got my configuration variables, which doesn't mean anything yet. Let me go back to my settings again. So here is my Acme Deploy. And one of the things that I have here is I've got add-ons. So what I want to do with my add-ons is I want to put in Postgres. So I'll start typing in Postgres. And it says Heroku Postgres. And it says, well, here's a free version of Postgres that you could use, and I'm going to provision it. Now, what it ends up having here is that there is, if I ended up going in here and looking here, these are, there's a database that ends up automatically getting created that's available to me. So one of the things that, you don't actually have to manually go in here and create the database. I also just want to show you something else. There is so this actually takes us to a different site, but if I look under my settings here, once I do that, what happens is that there's a configuration variable, which is my connection string to my database. And so what I'm going to do here is that, now you see it's not called connection, it's called database URL, but there is a database, and it is a database that I could connect to. And so I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to modify my code a little bit. So instead of using connection, I'm going to use database URL because that's what it's going to use on Postgres. And this will be database URL too. Again, these are going to be using local databases. But on my start, I don't need to put anything here because it's going to be using that database URL. That's basically, when you look at these variables, these are your configuration variables. These are your environment variables that are set up for you. The same way that you didn't have to put in a port because it's set up for you. This is the variable for your database. And now the only thing I need to do is that I do need to go back to in the only other place that I have my connection string, which is up here. This is going to be database URL. Okay, so now I've got a database. And let's go back over here and let's look at our status. And I'll say git.add. Git.commit.m. Use database URL for config. And I'll go over here and I'll say git.push to Heroku master. And we're almost there. Let's go and try to run this again. We've got to still have a server error. Let's take a look and see what it is. So we'll say Heroku Logs. Let's see what the error is. Okay, so now we see a different error. And this error says, all right, I was able to connect to your database, but we've got a problem that I don't know, this user's relation doesn't exist in the database. And that's why I set it up so that, if you remember, we've got something in our code that says, hey, look, if you have an environment variable called seed, I'll go and seed your data. So one of the things you can do, whenever an environment variable changes on Heroku, it actually restarts the application. So I'm going to go in here and put in seed is true. And it'll actually go and restart the application. One thing that's kind of interesting about that is that if I was to go back and look at my Heroku logs, I should see that it was able to seed the data. And what I should also probably do is I don't want this to seed every time I restart my application. I'm not sure that I want to reseed my data every time, so I'm adding this. I don't want it to wipe out my data the next time that I go and do a deployment. I only want to seed, when I want to seed. So I'm going to kill this. It's going to restart again. And now, hopefully, I'll have my 2 users. So that's how you go and deploy on Heroku. Now, again, if we didn't end up having a database, it's a very simple process. It's a little bit trickier when you have a database. And here, again, we're leveraging the idea that we have this seed function to go in there and modify our environment variables to seed the database. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of showing you how to deploy an app.